Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we've got one more thing to do to the ClodBuster. We've got 13-turn brush motors installed, which with the stock gearing do feel a little bit stressed. They never really get up to their peak RPM. So here we have a set of adjustable motor mounts from eBay. They look like copies of the old ThunderTech ones. The main thing is they're easily available without having to deal with the extra costs of buying from the States. Before we fit the mounts to the Clod, we're going to use another 540 motor and just check and see how they go together. If we empty out the bag and separate out all the bits, we have 4 countersunk screws to attach the motors to the mount, 4 M3 nylock nuts to clamp the mount to the gearbox, the cover plate with a little window so you can see the mesh while you're setting it, the adjustable mount itself, and 4 M3x35s that go through the gearbox. From the back of the adjustable plate then, we need to drop in 2 of the long screws into the slotted holes. Flip it over, offer up the motor so the countersunk holes line up with the holes in the motor and fit the 2 countersunk screws. Now the cover plate goes over the end and you'd use the nuts to clamp it to the gearbox. All seems quite reasonable, except they've used the wrong screws. As soon as the nylock nuts start to grip the thread, the screws are just going to spin and you won't get anywhere. They've included round-headed screws that don't lock into the slots. The mounts these ones are most likely copies of use hex-headed screws, easily available but a bit naff that they don't include them. The idea is that they sit in the slots and they can't rotate. The reality though is the slots are a bit too wide. It's going to work, but it won't take much to push them past the peaks on the heads. Next up then, there's the colour. Why they decided to make them brown, I'll never know. There's a lot of other brown parts around for Tamiya kits now too, so I suppose someone liked it. So before we fit them, we need to strip the anodizing. We're going to use some sodium hydroxide to do the job. It's not something to be trifled with. It'll burn and generally give you a bad time. It's best done outside with goggles and gloves. If you do give it a go, it is of course at your own risk. Next then, we need a jar with some lukewarm water in. We don't need to fill up the jar. It's good to have the liquid well below the top, so if it splashes, it can't escape. I've never measured it, but we need to carefully pour in some sodium hydroxide. I usually end up with a way too strong of a mix, but it works. Mix up the solution until most of the bits have dissolved. Now I'm going to leave this bit in real time, as one of the things that does get asked quite a lot is how long do you leave the parts in the solution? With a strong mix, it's not as long as you might think. You have to be a bit careful as the solution will happily eat through the anodizing and keep going with the aluminium. If you've got any screw threads, you have to take extra care. Another thing, as it's doing its thing, it's going to bubble and gas quite a bit. It's probably best not to breathe it in, so the old well-ventilated area is a must. Outside is even better. I found there's not much point in agitating it. The bubbles do a good enough job of that by themselves. The liquid in there is moving around quite nicely. After a minute or so, it's time to check. Now I use a stainless steel pair of slightly rough tweezers to get the parts out. Just make sure you've got a good grip so you don't drop it back in and make a splash. When the anodizing has been removed, run the part under some cold water and very thoroughly rinse it. You want to do this fairly quickly as the solution will continue eating away while you're dawdling. A little while later we have 4 parts stripped and looking far more in keeping with the rest of the ClodBuster. The actual quality of the parts is rather good once you remove all the brown. Next we've got the cover plate and the windows. They'll get sandwiched between the plate and the gearbox, but it's going to be much easier to deal with if they don't keep dropping out while we're fitting them. I'm going to use a few spots of a medium CA to stick the windows in. It's also going to help keep any water out. We just need to use a few tiny spots, then use a cocktail stick with a blob of blue tack on the end to place the window. We do both and leave them to dry while we get the motors ready. So we can get at the motors and the gearbox, we're going to need to remove the wheels using our very posh brand name nut driver. Pop the chassis up on a box and reframe the video. On this axle we've got a couple of non-standard parts because I lost the originals long ago. If we take the motor screws out, we can get rid of the 3D printed cover plate and pop out the two brass tubes. So we can use the new adjustable mount. I've sourced a pair of stock tubes, which you can see are quite a bit longer than the ones I made. When doing up the motor screws, these stop you from squashing the plastic gearboxes, so they have to be just the right size. Next, with the motors removed, we can remove the old pinion. The stock size is a 13-tooth 32 pitch. This is a steel one, of course. To replace it, I've got an 11-tooth 32 pitch pinion. They're really easy to find, as they're one of the sizes used on the Traxxas TRX4. Before we fit it, we're going to need to fit the adjustable plate with the hex-headed screws to the motor, which should have been really easy. But once the countersunk screws were done up, the long screws were solid, the heads being trapped between the face of the motor and the plate. Annoying, but not too difficult to work around. I used a grinder to take a fraction of a millimetre off the top of the screw heads, so there's a bit of clearance. After refitting the screws and the plate, we have a pair of screws that move freely in the slots. Next, the new pinion goes on, and we're going to need to fit it so the teeth line up with the plastic gear in the gearbox. It'll take a bit of trial and error, but it's critical it's all in line. And don't forget when you're doing the test fits to make sure you've got the two metal tubes over the threads on the long screws. When it's spot on, we offer up the cover plate and use the nuts. I'm also going to use some steel washers just so there's something solid for the nuts to go down on. In theory, all we need to do is tighten them up most of the way and adjust the mesh. Now, the bottom nut went on okay, but the top one very quickly made the hex on the screw head slip in the slot, which really isn't good. Do that too often and it's just going to spin freely, making it really difficult to remove again. Now again, there's an easy workaround. Instead of the nylocks, I'm going to use a pair of Tamiya grip nuts. They'll spin on with very little effort, and by the time we're using any real torque to spin the nut, the screw head will be pulled against the inside of the mount, so it won't spin, hopefully. With the nuts on, just taking up the slack, we can adjust the mesh. We need to move the motor until we can see a little bit of slot between the gears through the window. When it's spot on, nip up the nuts and recheck. More often than not, once the nuts are tight, the motor will probably have moved just enough to change the mesh. What we have now is just a little on the tight side. We want a touch more slot between the gears. It's going to take a few attempts, but it's important it's right to avoid any issues in the future. When it's spot on and the nuts are tight, I'm going to lock them in place with two more plain nuts. We grip the first nut so they can't slip, and we tighten the second nut behind them. It doesn't look as nice as a pair of nylocks, but it's going to work just as well. So that's the rear done. We just need to do the same at the front. It's exactly the same process, so we're just going to cut to the next step. Right, now we have some more sensible gearing for the 13-turn motors, we can crank up the motor timing. Now, as mentioned before, the best video to watch on this is from Holmes Hobbies, so I'll stick a link to that in the description. In short though, all we do is loosen the two screws that clamp the end belt in position so we can turn it. This is adjusting the relation between the brushes and the magnets. 0 degrees is where the brushes are right in the middle of the magnets. We want some timing advance, so the brushes come in early. The front motor spins a normal way, so we turn the end belt anti-clockwise a few degrees. The rear motor spins backwards, so we need to turn the end belt clockwise. 5 or 10 degrees tends to be all you need. After that you get diminishing returns and you'll see the motor life start to reduce. With all that done, we can connect up a battery and see how it sounds. Well, yep, that sounds pretty good. It's a little bit rattly, but that's going to be the gearboxes rather than the motors. I think then we can refit the wheels, pop the body back on, and go for a test run. With the new gearing, the throttle is absolutely responsive. It no longer takes a second or two to wind up, making it a lot more predictable. We can really lean on it now too, without the motors generating much heat at all. They're still brushed motors, of course, so they are going to wear out before long, but they're performing excellently. On another note, as I'm putting this video together, it's Wednesday night and we've got 9,999 subscribers. So I should think by Sunday we'll be past 10k. So thanks for everyone who subscribed and watched the videos. Hopefully next year we'll be back at some shows for some more varied content. Right, that's it from me this week then. There should be another extended cut video with the clod bashing up around now too, link in the description. So until next week, thanks for watching, like if you liked, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment if there's something on your mind. Bye guys!